There comes a moment in every person's life when their silence, their calm gaze, or their refusal to react the way they once did begins to unsettle others. It's the moment an old friend says, "You've changed, but can't quite explain why." This introduction is about that moment, those subtle shifts inside you that feel natural, yet somehow threaten people who are still living in yesterday's version of themselves. Think of the old folk tale of the village boy who used to shout angrily at the wind, but one day stopped, listened, and walked away. Everyone feared he had become cold, but in truth, he had simply grown. Maturity works like that, invisible to you, confronting to others. The Stoics understood this transformation long before modern psychology gave it a name. They believed that a person's inner world could become so steady that it radiated outward, quiet, powerful, unmistakable. Not just through self-control, but through self-possession, a kind of moral gravity. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. The more a person shapes those colors, their attitudes, choices, and intentions, the less predictable they become to those who still rely on emotional chaos or impulsive reactions. Stoicism teaches that maturity isn't a soft glow. Sometimes it's a sharp edge, and that edge can make others uneasy. So the real question becomes this: when these signs of inner strength begin to unsettle the people around you, what should you do with that power? Should you soften it, hide it, or learn how to use it wisely? That is the path we now need to explore. Before we dive deeper into these hidden signs of inner strength, do me one favor. If this opening struck a chord with you, if you've ever felt yourself outgrowing the noise around you, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share your own experience in the comments. Your voice isn't just engagement, it's part of a growing community of people who are quietly becoming stronger, wiser, and more stoic than they ever expected. Your interaction helps this message reach others who might be standing on the edge of their own transformation, wondering if they're alone. Let's show them they're not. Sign 1. Humility. There's a certain kind of humility that doesn't look soft or shy. It looks like quiet thunder. It's the kind of humility that unnerves people because it doesn't beg to be seen, yet it cannot be ignored. When you grow more mature, you begin carrying yourself with a calm confidence that refuses to compete with anyone. It's like the old mountain tale. The tallest peak never shouts. It lets the winds announce its greatness. This kind of inner stillness is dangerous to those who rely on noise, performance, or ego to feel important. Yet for you, it becomes a source of strength, an anchor that keeps you steady even when the world around you trembles. The Stoics saw humility not as shrinking yourself, but as being honest about your place in the grand theater of life. Epictetus reminded his students, "You are not your reputation, but your character." True humility grows when you stop trying to control how others see you and start working on who you actually are. In psychological terms, this is the shift from external validation to internal grounding. And that shift threatens people who depend on your old insecurities because now their approval has lost its power over you. Humility also carries a strange cinematic contrast. The more you know, the less you feel the need to prove it. Imagine a seasoned warrior who walks through a village without his sword drawn. The villagers whisper, "He must be dangerous, not because he shows strength, but because he doesn't need to show it." As you mature, you stop correcting everyone, stop arguing every point, stop fighting for the last word. Your quiet restraint becomes louder than their noise. This restraint, paradoxically, is what makes others feel exposed. Their impulsiveness, their pride, their insecurities suddenly stand out against your calm presence. And this raises the real question, the one the Stoics themselves wrestled with. How do you use this powerful form of humility without letting it harden into coldness or superiority? Humility can guide, inspire, and steady your life, but if mishandled, it can also isolate you. Knowing the difference is the next step on the path of maturity and the journey that lies ahead. Sign 2. Open-mindedness and acceptance of new experiences. There's a moment in adulthood where you stop clinging to the familiar and start stepping willingly into the unknown, and that shift alone can unsettle people around you. Open-mindedness might sound gentle, but in reality, it's a courageous rebellion. Imagine an old story from the mountains. An elder tells the villagers that beyond the forest lies a wider world, but no one dares to cross the tree line. Until one day, a quiet young shepherd does. He returns not with treasure, but with new stories, new tools, and a new way of thinking. The villagers fear him not because he's stronger, but because he's no longer trapped in their boundaries. This is what open-mindedness looks like, a step forward that others interpret as a threat. The Stoics believed that a wise person moves through life with curiosity, not fear. Seneca once wrote, "There are more things to learn than time allows." He wasn't just talking about knowledge, he meant experiences, perspectives, and the courage to let the world reshape you. When you become more mature, you stop treating new situations as dangers and start seeing them as teachers. This willingness to expand unsettles those who cling to their comfort zones. They see your growth as disloyalty, your curiosity as defiance, your change as abandonment of the old you they depended on. What makes this dangerous to others, psychologically, is that your openness exposes their closed doors. When you try new ideas, explore new paths, or welcome unfamiliar viewpoints, you quietly break the unspoken pact. Many people rely on the pact that says, "Stay like me, so I don't feel left behind." Your openness forces them to confront the stagnation they've been avoiding. In a cinematic sense, you become the character who walks off the well-lit path into a misty unknown, and the rest of the cast panics because they can't follow. But the Stoics would say that discomfort is not your burden to carry. Growth demands motion, even when it casts a shadow. And so the real question arises. When your openness to new experiences begins to widen the gap between you and the people who fear change, how do you continue growing without losing your connection to them or yourself? This is where the next chapter of maturity begins, and where your choices will matter more than ever. Sign 3. Rational decision-making. There comes a point in adulthood when your choices stop being reactions and start becoming deliberate, measured movements, almost like placing stones one by one across a river. And strangely, that calm precision can frighten people who operate on impulse. Rational decision-making isn't cold, it's powerful. Picture the old folktale of the wise fisherman. While others rushed their boats into the storm chasing bigger catches, he watched the clouds, studied the currents, and launched only when the sea whispered it was time. He returned safely every season, while others blamed fate for their failures. His calm logic didn't make him popular, but it made him respected and eventually untouchable. That's the kind of maturity that shifts the balance in any room. The Stoics saw rational thinking as the highest expression of human strength. But they didn't mean emotionless thinking, they meant clear thinking. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you would judge, understand first." Rationality to the Stoics was about slowing down enough to see what's real instead of what fear or excitement paints in front of you. When you reach this stage of maturity, you no longer leap at every opportunity, panic at every threat, or cling to every familiar voice. You wait, you assess, and then you act with intention. People who rely on emotional chaos may see this calm reasoning as arrogance or distance, when in reality it's discipline. What makes rational decision-making unsettling to others is that it exposes their inconsistency. When you stop making choices out of guilt, pressure, or emotional manipulation, some people lose the influence they once had over you. You're no longer the person who can be convinced with panic or persuaded with flattery. In a cinematic sense, it's like the moment in a film where the protagonist finally stops running, turns around, and says, "No." The entire atmosphere changes not because they shouted, but because they thought before they spoke. Stoically speaking, Reason becomes your shield, not your sword. And this brings us to a crucial question. 1. The Stoics rarely answered directly because each person must face it alone. When your rationality becomes your strength, how do you keep it from turning into emotional detachment? Logic can guide you, but without compassion and connection, it can also isolate you. Understanding how to balance the two is where the deeper journey of maturity truly begins. Sign 4. Self-control. There's a kind of self-control that doesn't come from fear or discipline, but from deep inner evolution. It's the moment when someone provokes you, and instead of reacting, you simply look at them, calm and composed, as if you're observing a distant storm that can't touch you anymore. This kind of restraint is unsettling to people who expect the old you to snap, explode, or fall apart. It reminds me of an old folk story. A young blacksmith who used to argue with every villager grew up and learned to pour all his fire into the furnace instead of his words. People didn't know how to deal with this new version of him because nothing they said could bend him anymore. That's the kind of strength self-control becomes: quiet, intimidating, and deeply mature. The Stoics didn't treat self-control as suppression. They treated it as mastery. Seneca wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." For them, self-control wasn't about acting less. It was about acting with purpose. When you develop this kind of maturity, you start choosing when to speak, when to walk away, and when to let a moment pass. You no longer lose yourself in anger, fear, or the pressure of the moment, and that terrifies people who rely on emotional reactions to predict you or manipulate you. When they push, expecting you to break, your calm becomes a mirror reflecting their own instability. Self-control becomes dangerous to others because it disrupts old dynamics. Some people don't want you to think, they want you to react. They don't want you to pause, they want you to panic. But when you remain centered, when you don't raise your voice, when you don't get dragged into arguments you've outgrown, the whole emotional landscape changes. It's like a cinematic scene where the hero walks through chaos slowly, almost in slow motion, untouched. The crowd is shouting, the world is frantic, yet they move with the stillness of someone who has learned their own strength. Stoic philosophy describes this not as coldness, but as clarity, a kind of internal compass that helps you move through storms without drowning in them. But this power comes with a question every mature person eventually has to face. How do you keep your self-control from becoming emotional distance? When does being calm turn into being unreachable? When does strength turn into silence that isolates you from others? Finding that balance between steadiness and connection is the challenge that lies beyond simple composure, and it's the doorway to the next stage of real maturity. Sign 5. Appreciating solitude. There comes a stage in life when being alone stops feeling lonely and starts feeling like a return to your true self. This shift alone can make others uneasy. People who once depended on your constant presence, your replies, your availability, suddenly find you comfortable in silence, in slow mornings, in quiet walks. It's like the old folk tale of the woodcarver who left the bustling marketplace and built himself a small hut by the river. At first, the villagers mocked him. He must have lost his mind. But over time, they realized he had gained something they never had: peace. When you begin valuing solitude, you no longer chase people or noise. And this new calm can be intimidating to those who need distraction to feel alive. The Stoics saw solitude not as isolation, but as nourishment. Marcus Aurelius often wrote about withdrawing into yourself, not to escape the world, but to return stronger. Solitude becomes a place where you reorganize your thoughts, reshape your emotions, and clear the dust that daily life throws on the mind. It's where you practice honesty with yourself, something many people fear more than any external hardship. As you mature, your time alone becomes sacred, purposeful, and grounding. And in a strange way, people who once controlled you with guilt or attention-seeking behavior lose their grip, not because you push them away, but because you learn to stand on your own. Appreciating solitude is dangerous to others because it removes their power over your sense of belonging. When you don't fear being alone, manipulative people can no longer use abandonment as a threat. When you're comfortable with your own company, you stop settling for half-present relationships or draining conversations. Psychologically, solitude sharpens your boundaries. Cinematically, it's the moment the protagonist walks into the quiet mountains, not defeated, but transformed. The world keeps shouting, but they hear something deeper, their own voice. Seneca hinted at this inner clarity when he wrote, "A great mind becomes self-sufficient, and nothing is more unsettling to those who depend on your neediness." And inevitably, solitude raises a profound question, one you can't avoid as you grow. How do you use your newfound peace without letting it turn into emotional withdrawal? When does healthy solitude become a protective wall that keeps everyone out? Understanding that balance between being with yourself and staying connected to others is the next step on the path of maturity, and it's a step only you can take. Sign 6. Real listening, not just hearing. There comes a moment in maturity when you stop waiting for your turn to talk and start genuinely absorbing what others are saying. That shift, simple on the surface, can be unsettling to those who are used to performing, exaggerating, or manipulating. Real listening slows everything down. It makes conversations deeper, more honest, sometimes uncomfortably so. It reminds me of a folk story about a village elder who spoke rarely but listened closely. People who came to deceive him always left trembling because he saw through the cracks in their words. When you begin to listen with curiosity instead of reacting with ego, you become that elder, quiet, perceptive, and impossible to fool. The Stoics believed that listening was a form of wisdom in action. Epictetus famously taught, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." To them, listening wasn't passive, it was a discipline. It required humility, patience, and a willingness to understand before judging. As you grow more mature, you stop treating conversations like battles and start treating them like windows. You peek into another person's inner world, noticing their fears, their motivations, their inconsistencies. And that level of perception can unsettle people who relied on your old, distracted version of listening, the one that could be easily misled. What makes real listening dangerous to others is that it reveals truths many people try to hide. When you listen calmly, deeply, and without rushing to defend yourself, you catch the small details, tone changes, contradictions, emotional gaps. People who want to manipulate you often become nervous because their usual tactics fall flat. Psychologically, deep listening shifts the balance of power. Cinematically, it's like the moment the hero looks a villain in the eye and says nothing. Yet the villain suddenly realizes their mask is slipping. Your presence becomes sharper than any argument. But this powerful form of listening raises an important question, one that every mature person must eventually face. How do you listen deeply without absorbing other people's emotional burdens? Understanding where to draw that invisible line between empathy and self-protection is the next chapter in your growth, and one that will define the way you navigate every relationship moving forward. Sign 7. Not needing approval from others. One of the most dramatic shifts in maturity happens quietly. You wake up one day and realize you don't need anyone's applause to feel grounded. This inner shift is subtle but powerful. So powerful that it can unsettle people who once relied on your need for validation. It's like the old desert tale of the wanderer who stopped following the caravan's shouts and started following the stars instead. The caravan mocked him for walking alone, but he reached the oasis long before they did. When you stop depending on others to tell you who you are, you begin moving through life with the calm certainty of someone who trusts their own compass. And that confidence can feel threatening to those who depend on crowds for direction. The Stoics viewed independence from approval as a sign of true inner stability. Seneca wrote, The man who seeks approval from the crowd has made himself a slave. To them, freedom wasn't about isolation. It was about reclaiming your self-worth from the hands of others. As you mature, you stop bending your decisions to fit expectations and start choosing based on your values, your purpose, your wisdom. People who were used to influencing you through guilt, pressure, or emotional rewards suddenly realize their old tricks no longer work. It's not rebellion, it's evolution. What makes this independence dangerous to others is that it exposes their own insecurity. When you no longer chase compliments, they lose the leverage they once had. When you no longer fear disapproval, their judgments lose their power. Psychologically, you become unpredictable in the best possible way. They can't control your emotions, your choices, or your identity. It's like a cinematic moment when the protagonist steps out of the crowd, the noise fades, and the camera focuses on their eyes, steady, fearless, unshaken. That kind of inner authority makes people confront parts of themselves they'd rather keep in the dark. But this transformation brings a crucial question to the surface, one that determines the kind of person you become next. How do you stay free from others' approval without drifting into arrogance or emotional detachment? Independence is powerful, but without humility and connection, it can become a fortress. Finding the balance between self-assurance and openness is the next challenge on the path of true maturity. For those of you who've stayed with me until the end, congratulations, you've journeyed through the subtle but profound shifts that mark true maturity. These signs, humility, open-mindedness, rational decision-making, self-control, appreciation of solitude, real listening, and not needing approval, aren't just personal victories. They're quiet revolutions that ripple through every interaction you have. The Stoics remind us that growth often feels dangerous to the world around us because it reveals their limitations while showcasing our inner strength. But remember, this power is not meant to intimidate. It is meant to guide, to anchor, and to illuminate the path forward. Now it's your turn. Carry these lessons, explore your own growth, and see how far your maturity can take you without fear, without apology, and fully in command of your own life.